Hello, and welcome to the second video interview, which is part of the series ECMI Conversations with Experts. Each episode, we invite a prominent expert to discuss a specific topic with one of the ECMI researchers. This interview is going to be about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Roma communities across Europe. My name is Andreea Cârstocea. I'm a senior researcher at the ECMI, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to Iulius Rostas. And I'm just going to say welcome, Iulius, for now. And I would like now to just say a few words as to why ECMI has decided to make a video interview on this topic. And then I'll introduce Iulius to our listeners. So the reason why we decided to discuss the issue of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic today is that generally there have been quite a few anecdotal evidence of a high impact of the pandemic on Roma communities, whether concerning the difficulties these communities face in abiding by social distancing measures, perhaps due to the difficult housing conditions they live in, all the way to reports of police abuse or observations that there is an exponential increase of instances of hate speech, whether on social media or in everyday life. And this anecdotal evidence was actually confirmed by a study which was conducted by the ECMI in partnership with the University of Leicester and funded by the QR Global Challenges Research Fund of the University of Leicester. The evidence we managed to collect pointed towards a very high impact of the pandemic in the areas of education, health, housing, employment. And at the same time, during the phase of desktop research, which we conducted for this project, we also found a huge number of instances of hate speech online, and also many reports of police violence against Roma communities. So this is why we decided it would be a good idea to speak to Iulius on this topic. And before I start asking a lot of questions, I would like to introduce Iulius to everybody. So Iulius Rostas is a visiting professor at the National School of Political Science and Administration in Bucharest, Romania, and a member of the Pakiv Board of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture in Berlin. He has published extensively on Roma participation, Romani identity, Roma school desegregation, the Romani movement. And I would like to highlight his latest publication, which is A Task for Sisyphus, Why Europe's Roma Policies Fail, which was published last year with the CEU Press. And speaking of CEU, for several years, Iulius was the chair of the Romani Studies department at CEU.
Thank you, Andrea, for the very nice introduction.
So let's start with a generic question. What would you say makes the Roma case so special, if you want? Somebody who's not very knowledgeable about the situation of Roma communities might say, well, during the pandemic, everybody had to suffer. People lost their jobs. There are many pupils who are not able to attend remote education because of difficult conditions at home. And why would we speak about the impact of the pandemic on the Roma community?
I'd say the following. Roma were particularly vulnerable to the pandemic because of the poverty rates among Roma all over Europe. Mm-hmm. Second, the racism that they are subjected to all over Europe, and other social inequalities that they suffered also historically. So the combination of these three factors are key in explaining why they are so vulnerable. And then also there is a fourth dimension, which is very popular nowadays, that the virus doesn't discriminate, but the government measures to the virus do discriminate. And Roma, unfortunately, are part of the most vulnerable groups that are discriminated by this kind of measures taken by the governments to control the pandemic.
So when you speak about discrimination, would you mean in an indirect way or in a direct kind of discrimination? What do you mean?
No, in fact, I mentioned racism, but sometimes there are open actions against Roma, like police abuses that target specifically Roma communities. The lockdown imposed in specific neighborhoods inhabited by Roma. So these are targeted, these are not indirect. About the indirect are more subtle ones, like the digital divide. But no, I am talking here sometimes about, and not to say about the impact of the hate speech and hatred promoted by politicians, especially. So these are factors that make these groups vulnerable, and especially Roma.
And speaking about the impact of the pandemic, I would just go back to some of the results that our study found when investigating the impact of the pandemic on Roma communities in Eastern Europe. These were so we conducted our investigation in 7 Eastern European countries, which are not part of the EU. So, of course, there are certain limitations to the kinds of results that we obtained. But in any case, I think they are quite indicative. And I would just like to quote a few of the results, and I would then just let you comment on it. When we conducted our survey and asked our respondents a few questions about the impact of the pandemic on the access to education among Roma communities, we found that 55% of our respondents said that they had no computer at home and therefore online education was impossible. And 43 of them said that their internet connection was either inexistent or it was inadequate for withstanding on remote education. And also, this is related more to housing. 37% of our respondents said that their children had no private place to study, meaning that, of course, we're talking about overcrowding and the effects, the impact on it in dealing with the measures for social distancing. And our questions related, for instance, to healthcare found that around 20% of our respondents faced discrimination when trying to access medical services during the pandemic. While when we speak about impact on income and employment, 71% of our respondents say that the lockdown had an impact on their ability to work, and 73 of them agreed that their income was reduced during the pandemic. So these are quite severe numbers. How would you comment on these?
Well, the pandemic showed to the rest of the society that was not accustomed or had limited knowledge about social inequalities, the dimension of social inequalities in our societies. And the World Bank, the UNDP, different organizations have always presented data which show that the poverty rates among Roma are double and triple, or those at risk of poverty among Roma. The differences were huge. So these are coming now. When I am talking, of course, I'm talking about housing conditions. And here we just have, disparate numbers. But it's quite clear many Roma communities are isolated. Yeah. Eurodiaconia, for example, had a comparative study on this, and in Serbia they said that 12% of the Roma in Serbia live in segregated neighborhoods, while in Romania that number is 59. So when you have this kind of communities, and for everybody that knows something about Roma communities, these communities are also lack basic investments in infrastructure, sometimes electricity, no gas, no running water, no sewage. Yeah. So in these conditions, if you rely on accessing certain services online, these people are totally excluded, including education. But also their access to labor market. Yeah. And this pandemic showed us the cumulative aspect of these social inequalities. Meaning, if you are poor, most probably you live in an overcrowded house. Most probably you are paid, you have not a well-paid job that you have eventually to go in person, or you already are losing it. And then, because you cannot do work online, you don't have the skills for that. And then also, your children do not have enough space because the housing conditions are like they are. You don't have access to food, yeah, and water. And then how we can talk about social distancing, yeah, when you live in such conditions normally. How can we talk about, washing your hands, every time when, you come in contact with others and so on, yeah? When you don't have access to water even to drink. So definitely these conditions in Roma communities make them extremely vulnerable. Yeah. So that are just revealing the cumulative aspects of the social inequalities.
In your opinion, and perhaps you don't have an answer to it, but it's something that sort of came up during our interviews. Would you think that within Roma communities, Roma girls, young girls, are disproportionately affected by it? Because some of our respondents hinted that in the case of girls, they are not sure that after fundamentally losing one semester, perhaps now going to a second semester of learning, online learning, they might decide that perhaps it's not worth coming back to school after that. Would you see any potential impact on this group?
In general, girls, especially in some Roma communities, are more vulnerable, face additional difficulties in accessing education, especially after a certain age. But so far, we do not have data coming out from communities showing the disproportionate impact. Most probably it has, because in certain communities, if parents have to choose between a girl and a boy going to school, in most of the cases, they will choose the boy. And definitely in that respect, yeah, when you have scarce resources, very limited, then you have to make this kind of choices that are impossible.
Yes. This is what we found during our interviews. We didn't have a specific or not an extensive set of questions during our survey, but it sort of came up again and again during our interviews, and perhaps this is something that is worth researching in the future. So we sort of covered a few things about very practical and very concrete examples of how Roma communities were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, whether in terms of access to education or housing conditions, employment. But another part or another severe effect of the pandemic is also turns out to be an increase in hate speech and I would say almost scapegoating in certain countries of the Roma community for the spread of the pandemic. And of course, if you look at the difficulties that Roma communities have in respecting, in abiding by the rules about social distancing, about accessing education and so on, there is a case to say that, public opinion finds a reason as to why the Roma should be blamed, scapegoated for the spread of the pandemic. And this is, I should say, this is nothing new, and it has been written extensively about. We mostly know about the Nazi concept of the Judenfieber, which fundamentally blamed the Jewish community for the spread of the typhus fever. Even before that, during the Armenian genocide, Armenians were blamed by Turkish physicians for the spread of the typhus fever. So it's nothing new in a way. How would you comment on this? I'm sure you've seen instances in the media or on social media about it. How would you comment on this?
Well, if you want, it's just an extension of the scapegoating Roma were facing even before the pandemic. Just that now mainstream politicians came out and made it clear to the public that Roma are those spreading the disease, or they brought even the disease. And here it's, Roma and migrants. Yeah. And this depends from country to country. The two categories do not exclude each other. On the contrary, in many countries, they overlap significantly. So let me just give an example. A Romanian MP who happened to be a doctor in a hospital for, quite a number of years, appeared on TV, on main stations, and made it clear that Roma brought the disease and they are also spreading the disease. So he's not just an MP from a political party that, it's a social democratic one, should care a little bit about the vulnerable groups. But, he knows what he's talking about, and he intentionally does that. So it's not lack of knowledge. But the same happened in Bulgaria. The same happened also in Macedonia. In Hungary, of course, was the leading figures in the government saying that migrants and, in Slovakia, where the army surrounded even Roma neighborhoods, but also in Western Europe, the migrants that are spreading the disease. So it's a normal mechanism of scapegoating. It's nothing new. It's just that what makes it new now is that there is still a legal framework. And states that and institutions that we thought they would react to something like that failed miserably. Moreover, as those that studied the phenomenon knew, it was obvious that the law enforcement, and especially police, played a significant role in targeting and scapegoating Roma communities.
One of the observations I made during the pandemic in the earlier months, and I'll speak again about the Romanian context because I'm most familiar with it, was that actually you could see several instances of leading intellectuals who blamed Roma for everything from spreading the pandemic to somehow doing a lot of damage, let's say, to the health of the nation, if I may put it this way. And here is the question: if power structures continue, whether through their elites or through police and other bodies, continue to maintain this attitude towards Roma communities, what is the solution to this? How do we return, or how do we reverse this trend? What do you think?
Well, definitely this is a political problem. You cannot expect to have similar results in neighborhoods where, you know, are living rich people that have resources, including financial resources and so on, and have the same type of behavior in a ghetto-like neighborhood, yeah, where unemployment is huge, where education is, of very low quality, and where you lack basic infrastructure. Many Roma families, and not only, but I am talking now about Roma because they are overrepresented among the poor. Many parents, when the first measures, when the lockdown happened in different countries, yeah, they faced a dilemma. Should we stay inside the house and starve? Or should I go out and try to find something, some work, so I can earn a living and bring some food to my family? So that's quite a choice to be made. And of course, those that have this kind of resources, they for them it was something, they don't bother even to think. So, but coming back to the issue of racism is deep down in societies and in institutions, in the rules of the institutions, in the norms and in their values. Yeah, if we consider that lives and every human being matter and we act accordingly, then of course we care that everyone has something to eat. We generate also social solidarity, yeah, among our fellows, that to help those less fortunate. Yeah, we do not select people randomly on who should receive certain treatment and who doesn't. Yeah, that's how it should be. But we see in practice quite differently. So the question is, what can we do with this racism? Well, racism against Roma, or what we call anti-Gypsyism, it's for hundreds of years. Well, it is time, at least, that the states recognize racism. They should not be afraid. Racism is something, it's there. It depends if you recognize that you have racism as a problem and you start acting it. And of course, on a long term, it's education, but it's also something else. You have to put law to work in practice. You have also to invest in those that are victims of racism and to support them. Yeah. And a combination of these kind of measures will show results, not overnight, but definitely a society that takes those kind of measures in 10, 15, 20 years will look completely different.
I completely agree with you, but I think for that you need political will, and that means the elites are willing and acknowledge this problem, and at the same time you need governments, states, recognizing that this is indeed a problem and it needs to be tackled somehow. Do you feel that we are there, or is this something more for the future?
No, in fact, all the positive initiatives on Roma taken by governments and international organizations were determined by what was going on inside Roma. For example, migration played an important role in EU adopting EU framework for Roma national inclusion strategies. Yeah. So governments do not act just because they get enlightened, that they believe in human rights and humanity and so on. No, they just react when something goes on. So when we start blaming those that are doing some antisocial acts, my point is try to have a broader view and see the full picture, that because of those, they put pressure on the society and specifically on governments to react. And that's how, unfortunately, it happened. I think what we have to do now, especially, let's be optimistic, and the pandemic hopefully will end in a matter of months. Then all these societies will have to come together to analyze what happened and how to deal with issues such as poverty, social inequalities, and racism. Yeah, these three are key in all these societies, and we can see it from US, United Kingdom, Germany, to Romania and Bulgaria. Yeah? So we do have to act on these issues, and we have to come together to address it. And elites have a key role into this, because sometimes politicians, many of them, are going just for the votes. Yeah, what brings them votes? Elite get recognition for the society for what they have done. Yeah, it comes with a certain status, so they can afford taking a stand on social inequalities and speak out against racism and poverty, and also do something, along this.
This takes me quite nicely towards the conclusion of our short interview. And one of the questions that I had planned for you was, in this context where the news about the Roma communities surviving the pandemic are not positive at all, I wanted to ask you whether there was any ray of light in what you have seen. Were there any positive initiatives? Anything that showed that there are ways now, even within this short space of a few months, that helped some Roma communities? Is there anything positive coming out of this?
Absolutely. And here it's one example. Roma and pro-Roma NGOs, mainly Roma NGOs that are present in different communities. Yeah, it was a level of solidarity that some donors even accepted to redirect part of their funding to support people that need urgent help with food, with water, and so on. And I think that's absolutely fabulous. And that shows, in fact, that NGOs can react much quicker than bureaucracies and are more efficient. Now, this is particularly interesting because very often Roma NGOs are blamed for the failure of the policies and the funding that is available towards Roma. While in fact, if one makes an analysis of the funding available for Roma, including from EU sources, we'll realize that most of this funding goes to state institutions or to non-Roma NGOs. Very little is going to Roma NGOs. Anyway, in this case, the mobilization was, I would say, outstanding. I think in that sense, there is still hope. There is still hope that, humanity is there.
But you mentioned the efforts of civil society and how the outcomes of their efforts have shown a positive side, if you want. But I'm wondering, we're now on the brink, if not in the middle, of a second wave of the pandemic. The number of infections is really rising a lot every day. And without coordinated governmental response, I think it's very hard for Roma communities to face this second wave with as little damage as possible. So what would you think is the outlook for, let's say, the short to medium term future? How do you think Roma communities will withstand this second wave? Are they better prepared? Are governments better prepared? What do you think?
Well, some governments learned from the experience of the first wave, and they were improving. Some didn't, Then there are local authorities that play a significant role because they know the situation of the people on the ground. In a way, it's difficult if you are in the capital city of a country, in an office, to know the situation in so many communities. But local authorities should. And what should happen is that there should be mechanisms available to local authorities to act immediately whenever is needed, whoever needs support. And that's key. And it's not only money here. We are not talking only money. In fact, this pandemic showed us what in political science is called institutional performance. We could assess very well how that is working on the ground at the very local level. So it's not only about money, but it's about rules and procedures. And that's how you see a system working. Money are just one aspect, but if you have rules, you have procedures in place that people respect, then you contain the virus. If not, you can have, money, you can't do it just with money. So that's more important. I think there is a need. And those that were good managers at local level managed to bring together the whole community, local community, being them Roma and whatever, and to act together to contain the virus. Because if you have a divided community that doesn't care about the rules, then, you will have a problem there containing it. What I hope is that local authorities learn something and they will do it. Now, of course, NGOs have limited capacities, and we should not, first, they should not take the responsibility from the governments on this issue, because that's not their role. But on the other hand, if local authorities are working with these NGOs in providing services, to the communities, I think that's quite a good solution.
Well, I suppose it remains to be seen how the situation will develop and to what extent authorities, local, regional, or national, will be able to coordinate and use their resources to the best outcome possible. For now, I would just like to thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. And with this, thank you very much. And I hope we'll be in touch and we'll continue to cooperate in the future.
Absolutely.